Hello, welcome to day 3 of self-isolation. We're going to look at the book of Exodus today. Exodus is one of my favourite biblical books, actually. It's also, a bit like Genesis, a book of two halves. So we're going to look at the first 15 chapters today, and then we'll do the second half of it tomorrow. Let me take you through the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus. You may remember at the end of the book of Genesis, the people of the family of Jacob, so Jacob and his 12 sons and grandsons and the family that was beginning to grow, had all gone down to Egypt. And they'd gone down there because of the famine, but also they'd gone down there as guests of the Pharaoh because Joseph, one of the 12 sons, had been very useful to the Pharaoh in helping to preserve the nation at the time of famine. And so they went down as honoured guests to the Pharaoh. There's a wonderful moment at the end of Genesis, didn't talk about yesterday, where the aged Jacob actually blesses Pharaoh at Pharaoh's request. And they settle there. The book of Exodus picks up around about 400 years later. And it starts off by telling us a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. Now, obviously, he didn't know Joseph. Joseph was long dead hundreds of years ago. But the idea is that a new Pharaoh has come up who does not recognise what Joseph did, doesn't choose to remember the way that Joseph had been so useful to the nation, and instead sees this people group, which is now, rather than being a family, has now become a substantial people group. He sees them as a threat. He sees them within the borders of his land, thinks to himself, if they choose to they could exercise a coup or whatever, they're a threat. So he starts a number of measures to try to contain that threat. And you may remember on day 1, we spent some time looking at Genesis 1:28, where God has said to Adam and Eve, and therefore to all of mankind, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And when Pharaoh looks around at this people group that are in his nation, he's really concerned about the fact that they are being fruitful and multiplying and filling the land. Although the language sounds slightly different, actually the Hebrew is the same. So Pharaoh is looking at this people group who are doing exactly what they are intended to do, and he says, I can't be having that. And so he tries to work them to death, and tries to, when that doesn't really work, he then tries to have the baby boys, when they're born, murdered before they take their first breath. And there's a wonderful moment in chapter 1 where 2 Hebrew midwives stand against Pharaoh. They basically disobey him, and they tell the Pharaoh that, oh, those Hebrew women, they're very they're very hardy women. They call us late and they give birth before we arrive. And I'm sorry, but all these boys are just slipping through our fingers. We can't possibly murder them. Wonderful moment of civil resistance. Chapter 2, so that's kind of the backdrop to the problem. Chapter 2, we meet Moses, and Moses is going to be the great figure who is going to bring the people out of slavery in Egypt. What I didn't really say is I said that Pharaoh was trying to work them to death. He's getting them to build store cities by forced labour. And it's a very harsh, cruel existence. So Moses is born in this time when the midwives have kind of given the Pharaoh the slip. So he's now sending soldiers around to find the baby boys and to kill them. When Moses is born, his mother manages to hide him for 3 months. Can you imagine trying to hide a newborn baby? How would you stop a baby from crying when the soldiers came around? But after 3 months, this baby is becoming more and more vigorous and noisy, and she realises it's getting harder and harder to keep him safe. So she makes a little basket. You probably know this story. She makes a basket of rushes, and she coats it with pitch to make it waterproof, and she puts him inside and hides him among the bulrushes. I don't think, and I may be wrong, I don't think she just kind of floats him away and says, goodbye, my son, good luck, hope you come to safety. I think she puts him there to hide him while the soldiers are doing their inspection, and then perhaps goes back at the end of the day and finds him and brings him back. That's my guess, but the text doesn't make it clear. She leaves Moses' sister to keep an eye on Moses, make sure he's safe while he's in hiding there. And then you probably know the story. The Pharaoh's daughter, Pharaoh would have had many daughters, but one of the princesses comes down to bathe, spots the basket, has it brought to her, finds the baby and thinks she'll adopt the baby. At which point, up steps Miriam, the sister, who's presumably still a little girl, but very quick thinking, and she says, "Oh, madam, you'll be wanting a wet nurse for the baby. I think I could probably find one for you." So the princess says, "Oh yes, great, send us, find me a wet nurse." And so Miriam goes and gets Moses' own mother, who comes and is wet nurse to Moses while he's growing up. Moses, all in this chapter, Moses grows up. He one day comes out to inspect the workings, to have a look at at how the slave cities are being built. We assume that he has been taught about his own identity, perhaps by his own mother, because he looks around and he sees the ways that the Egyptians are treating the Hebrews, and it makes him very angry. And so he looks this way and that, which makes it premeditated, and he murders one of the overseers who's been beating a Hebrew. As a result of which, he has to fly off, has to run to the desert, and he flees there, and he's there for 40 years. He gets married, he works for his father-in-law looking after the sheep. Chapter 3, God shows up. And God encounters Moses in a bush that is burning but is not being consumed. And God says to Moses, "I want you to go back to Egypt." Moses was 40 years old when he ran away, and he's been another 40 years in the desert. So at this point, the narrative tells us that Moses is 80 years old, and Moses does not want to go back to Egypt. He's a wanted man, and he's kind of neither flesh nor fowl, really. He feels neither Hebrew nor Egyptian. And he's got a comfortable life. He has no intention of going back. And he and God have a prolonged discussion about the matter. You might say argument about the matter. But eventually God prevails. And so Moses goes back to Egypt. Moses goes back and he goes to the Pharaoh and he appeals to the Pharaoh for the Hebrew people, at which point Pharaoh ramps up what he's doing, and he says, well, you've been making bricks for the city. Now I'm not going to give you the straw to make the bricks. You have to go out and find the straw in order to make the bricks, but the quotas are the same. This is sort of model of abusive employment that actually we see very often still in our own society today, where people's goals remain the same, but their tasks become harder. As a result of which, Moses and his brother Aaron, who's been tasked to help him, mediate a series of plagues which come upon the Egyptian nation. Pharaoh, and it's this big showdown really between Pharaoh and Moses, if you like, between the gods of Egypt and the true God. We also encounter the magicians and the courtiers of Pharaoh as well. So these are the 10 plagues, and they gradually escalate in their severity. First of all, the river gets turned to blood, and then there is a plague of frogs. And there's a really funny bit with both of those stories where the court magicians of Pharaoh manage to emulate those tricks, if you like, those, and so there's frogs everywhere, and Pharaoh says to the magicians, do something to help, and the magicians say, "We can make frogs too," which I'm not entirely sure is very constructive. But after the second one, they are no longer able to emulate the miraculous nature of what's going on. So we have blood and we have frogs, then we have gnats and flies. These are starting to be more than a nuisance. They're starting to cause disease. So we get plague on livestock, we get boils on people. And then we get 2 that are going to destroy the crops. We get the hail, really bad hail, which destroys the first crops. Interestingly, at this point, Pharaoh's officials bring their animals in when they hear the warning. So they are starting to believe that God means what he says. Then you get a plague of locusts, which comes down and kills the second crop. So they've got a number of different crops that come into harvest at different times. Hail gets the first ones, locusts get the second ones. This is very serious indeed. Then there is a plague of darkness, and then, as we're going to talk about, there is a plague of death. These 2 last ones really are symbolic of the end of days. These are symbolic of the end of the world. If if the sun is the means of all life, not only as we understand it in scientific terms, but also in ancient sort of mythological terms, when the sun artificially darkens, that is the end of the world, really, in that sort of the way that they thought in those days. So and we'll talk about the death one in a minute, which is also kind of an end of the world idea. So we have these 10 plagues, and basically what happens is each time Moses goes in and he says to Pharaoh, if you don't let my people go, then this is what will happen. And Pharaoh says, I will not let God's people go. And then the plague happens. And then we get sort of various versions of this particular pattern, which is where Pharaoh says, okay, I'll let you go, or I'll let you go some other way, or I'll let some of you go, and so on. If only you'll take the plague away. And then Moses takes the plague away on God's behalf, and then Pharaoh says, only tricking, didn't really mean it, no, you can't go. And basically this is the pattern of what happens. And then we get the final one, the plague of death. So the word goes out that on this particular day, the angel of death will pass over and will visit every house, and the oldest son, the oldest child, will die that day. But there is provision. There is provision for you to be saved from this, to protect your household from the angel of death. And this is by following some particular instructions. And if you follow these instructions, I'll tell you what they are in a minute, then the angel of death will pass over your house and will not enter it. And this is how this becomes known as the Passover event. These are the instructions. The people are to be ready to go because they are going to get the word. When Pharaoh wakes up and finds that death has touched the land, he will say, get out of here. So you need to be ready to go. So you bring a lamb into your house, a perfect one, a year old, and on the day that you're told, you will kill it, as you do when you're going to eat. You will eat it with unleavened bread because you haven't got time to yeast the bread. You're going to be ready to go. You eat it standing up with your coat on, your bags packed, your belt tied around your waist. You're ready, you're poised to be off. But before you eat it, you take a bunch of hyssop, which is a herb, you dip it in the blood of the animal, and you slosh it around the door, the lintel of the door of your dwelling. And when the angel of death sees that blood, he will pass over. This is going to become a deeply symbolic idea, which is going to be picked up again and again and again in Scripture. And so this is what happens. It is very clear that this provision is available to anyone. It is not just the Hebrews who can take advantage of this. And we know this because in chapter 12, verse 28, when it has happened and Pharaoh has said, get out of here, then they leave and they are a mixed multitude. In other words, it's not just Hebrews that go out. It is a number of other people groups as well, and we assume some Egyptians as well. A mixed multitude goes out because this act of mercy, this provision of mercy, is available to everybody, to all who choose to avail themselves of it. And then they are led out, and they are led by a pillar of fire and cloud. And this is an important idea that I want to talk about for just a minute. A number of places in this story, from Exodus onwards, we are going to find God showing up and being represented by fire, cloud, or sometimes smoke, thunder and lightning, earthquake, wind, trumpet. I think that's 7, and I think I've got them all. Sometimes, whenever you see a cluster of those things, this is known as a theophany. And this is a visible manifestation of, a tangible manifestation of the presence of God. Fire and cloud or smoke, thunder and lightning, wind, trumpet blast, earthquake. So here we have the pillar of fire and cloud. This is a theophany. This is the manifestation of God leading his people out of Egypt. Incidentally, we've already had a theophany, and that was at the burning bush where God encountered Moses there. So that was our first one. And here the pillar of fire and cloud is our second one. Then they come to the Red Sea. God has led them through the desert to this body of water. We're not sure what's being referred to here, but there is a body of water that is blocking their path. And they look back over their shoulders and they see the army of Pharaoh coming with his chariots, and they are trapped between the sea and Pharaoh. And then something very interesting happens. Now, what we need to understand is that in the ancient mind, both in within the Hebrew worldview, but also in the worldview of the peoples around, sea represented the forces of chaos. And when the god, whichever god is being referred to, whenever the god creates, he clears chaos. I think I talked about this a couple of days ago, and he kills the monster of chaos. And so here they are, trapped in front of this sea, and sea represents chaos. And now, can you remember what happens? So God tells Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea, and the wind blows all night. Now, the word wind is ruach, and the ruach also can be translated as spirit. So back in Genesis 1, we had the ruach of God, the wind or the spirit of God, over the face of the waters. Here, we have water of chaos. We have wind blowing over it. And then the sea parts and divides, and there is dry ground. We had this in Genesis 1. Wind blew, sea, waters parted, and dry ground emerged. Here we have the next new creational event. The people pass through the sea in safety. Pharaoh and his chariots follow them. The waters come back over the top. There is something about Pharaoh that is being represented not only as anti-creational, as I showed you, but as opposed to God himself, and if you like, in kind of mythic terms, a monster of chaos himself. And here you have chaos being given back to the forces of chaos. That is the end of Pharaoh and his army as far as the story it goes. And on the other side, Moses and the people celebrate with a great song of victory. That's as far as we're going to go today. But I want to drill down on one particular theme before I finish. And this is the theme about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. This is something that gives people a lot of anxiety sometimes, because there is language, you'll find language as you read this story of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And sometimes people think that means that God has prevented Pharaoh from repenting, prevented Pharaoh from doing the right thing. God has sort of constrained him in such a way that he has to come to judgment. And this then feels very unfair. Just a couple of things to point out about this particular theme. First is to talk about who is hardening the heart. So if I just run through that really quickly. After the plague of blood, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. After the plague of frogs, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. After the plague of gnats, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. After the plague of flies, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. After the plague of livestock, the heart of Pharaoh was heavy. Doesn't describe who does it, but it describes how it was. Implication, I think, is still that he is doing it himself. After the boils, God hardens his heart. After the hail, Pharaoh again hardens his own heart, so do all his servants. We get the word 3 times there. Then after the locusts, God is doing it. After the darkness, God is doing it. And in the run-up to death, God is described as doing it. And we get it 3 times at the Red Sea. I will harden his heart, says God. So we very much get this idea that Pharaoh is hardening his own heart at the beginning, and then God appears to be helping him on the way towards the end of that narrative. The other thing to be understanding is perhaps what these words mean in their ancient context. And there are 2 main words that are being used here. One is kavad, and kavad is relates to the word heaviness. It's to make something heavy. Now the heart in the ancient mind is the place of the will. If something is heavy, if a part of the body is heavy, it's not functioning properly. Moses complains at the burning bush that he is heavy of mouth and tongue. In other words, he's not very articulate. His tongue doesn't work very well. And if the heart is the place of the will and it is made heavy, then there's something about it not operating well. About it not functioning as it should. The other idea, which has probably been invoked here, is that, as you may know if you've ever visited an Egyptian museum, that one of the ceremonies that they think took place after somebody died was that the heart was weighed, and it had to be as light as a feather in order to meet approval of the gods. If it was heavy, it was a sinful heart. So these ideas, I think, are being represented here, are being drawn upon here when this language is used. The other word that's used is chazak. And chazak is the word of rigidity, of firmness. And when someone hardens their heart, or someone's heart is hardened, using that word, it's the idea of being confirmed in one's purpose, of becoming unswerving or resolute. So I think what we have here is we have Pharaoh making up his mind, hardening his own heart, making himself bold and or determined and resolute in his purpose. And then God, towards the end, saying, very well, I'll hand you over to whatever it is you have chosen to do. I will confirm your purpose in that. There is a theme that we encounter again and again in Scripture, and I'll point it out in other places as we go through, where God says to people, very well, have it your own way. And I think that's an example of what's going on here. And I think at the Red Sea, where Pharaoh as chaos is subsumed by the waters of chaos, again we have God saying, very well, have it your own way.